Hi everybody, today I'll be doing a book review on Against Individualism, which is a 2015 book by Henry Rosemont Jr. The full title is Against Individualism, a Confucian Rethinking of the Foundations of Morality, Politics, Family, and Religion. And this is a 2015 book in which Rosemont examines the Confucian metaphysics, ethics, morality, and politics. And what's really interesting about it is he looks at it from both a historical as well as a contemporary perspective. And he uses analytic philosophy as sort of a common denominator by which not only to compare the historical and the contemporary perspectives, but also in a lesser sense to compare the Eastern tradition of philosophy, more specifically Confucianism, with the sort of more Western tradition of philosophy more generally, and sort of the more westernized assumptions, specifically metaphysical assumptions, but also ethical and political assumptions that we have here in the West. And he compares and contrasts that, or those as well, using analytic philosophy. And towards the beginning of the book, Rosemont discusses how a lot of Eastern philosophies, including Confucianism, are unfortunately misunderstood because a lot of Western philosophers throughout history have been looking at Confucianism essentially from a Western perspective with their own metaphysical and ethical assumptions, as well as for more technical assumptions in methodology as well as in style with writing and metaphysics in philosophy. And he talks about how sort of putting Confucianism in terms of analytic philosophy allows someone from more of a Western background to sort of examine Confucian philosophy and see that it is actually a pretty decent philosophy, and it can stand up to, in comparison to, a lot of Western philosophy. Whereas when he talks about how historically, because it's been very misunderstood, it's usually seen as sort of bad philosophy or possibly even illegitimate philosophy. And I think Rosemont does a really good job of making Confucianism understandable and also making a case that it's a very decent philosophy. I made a small crack at Confucianism before, and this thing that I just discussed really hit me when I read it from Rosemont, because I think that's actually what I did. I read some Confucius, and I thought, this is interesting, but I didn't really hold it in super high regard. And after maybe a few weeks or possibly a few months, maybe in a few days, to be honest, after I finished it, it didn't really impact my life or my philosophical thinking that much, whereas this book certainly has. And so what Rosemont does is, in this book, is he's identified what he sees as a contemporary problem, and he offers a Western problem, and he offers a historical and an Eastern solution in Confucian ethics. And the contemporary problem is what Rosemont sees as a lack of social justice, or at least significant social justice in the West. And more alarmingly, this isn't just a lack of social justice due to inadequate political participation or some forms of oppression or anything like that. It's more fundamental and alarming than that. It's more at the foundation, at the metaphysical sort of level or realm. We have what he sees as a flawed metaphysical assumption that he calls foundational individualism, which then permeates, if that's the right word, upwards or sort of downwind into the ethical and the political realms. And so therefore, trying to do stuff in the ethical and political realms with those metaphysical foundations and assumptions, it's sort of hard, if not impossible, for the West to seek what he would see as a sort of a sufficient level of social justice without sort of at least critically examining, if not changing, our metaphysical assumptions. And as I said, the metaphysical assumption he sees as so damaging is foundational individualism. Now, he compares this to the Confucian idea of persons, or maybe you could say individuals. And his idea is essentially that, according to Confucianism and Confucius, individuals aren't sort of the atomic unit, the atomic ethical unit, or even metaphysical unit of society, because individuals are not unencumbered persons. whereas in the West they are seen as unencumbered persons, meaning the individual can sort of stand alone by themselves, and sort of be examined metaphysically, without any sort of external considerations. And they can also be seen as a actor ethically, if not politically, as an individual. Whereas Rosemont argues that metaphysically you can't even understand a person, a singular individual, by themselves. You need they are encumbered by their social situation and by the relations that they have to other people as well as the society as a whole. And he makes a comparison between a peach and an onion, where a Western person, we kind of see people more like peaches, where there's all these characteristics to them that they have, but you can sort of peel all that away, and essentially you're going to get to the core of who they are, their real, like who they really are. Whereas in the Confucian tradition, it's more like an onion, where people have these relations on the outside of it. There's sort of more arbitrary relations that you might have with like an acquaintance or something like that, and then you peel that layer off, and then as you get closer to the center, you get into more personal relations that you would have with a parent or with a spouse, children, etc. But eventually, once you peel away all of those relations, there's nothing left. There's no core, there's no metaphysical being outside of those relations that you could understand. And that also holds, Rosemont argues, that for Confucianism at the ethical level. At the ethical level, it's hard to understand individuals outside of the context of their social relations and their social interactions with people, including their interactions with strangers, countrymen, neighbors, etc. And I thought this was really interesting. I thought it was very eye-opening, very well argued. And another thing I wanted to say is he talks about the Western politics, and he identifies libertarianism and sort of classical liberalism as essentially as the final conclusion of that metaphysical assumption in the realm of politics and ethics. And he basically argues that all other competing political ideas, political ideologies within the Western context are flawed, and that basically libertarians are correct given the Western metaphysical assumption, and that played out in its conclusion eventually, the only sort of sound political position and ethical position in the West has sort of a more libertarian bent to it, which is also interesting. And then he goes after libertarianism as being unconducive to social justice, and stuff like that. Other things that I found interesting was that Rosemont says how a lot of people see roles in Confucianism as hierarchical, and while that might be sort of sometimes true in historical context and practice, in terms of philosophy and in terms of going forward in the future, we don't need to see role-bearing persons in a sort of hierarchical function. Or excuse me, actually no, you do, because they are. He says roles are hierarchical, but they're not elitist. So saying that someone is above someone else isn't necessarily saying that they're above them and better than them. It's just that people sort of have different relations to people, which are not always sort of equal. So I have a relation to teachers and my parents and my grandparents and maybe like a police officer who pulled me over, and that's a sort of hierarchical relationship to them, whereas to strangers or my spouse or my peers, it's more of an equal playing field. And he says that's kind of common sense, and that's also kind of how we metaphysically and ethically look at things. And I think that holds a lot of common sense. It stands to reason, as some might say. And then he says that the key to making roles not elitist and not oppressive is to always have them be mutually beneficial as well as natural. So it's only when you start getting into relationships where one person's benefiting and one person isn't, such as like slavery or something, and also relationships which aren't really natural, that's when you start getting into strange and improper relationships. And there was actually a really good quote somewhere in here on that, and I didn't mark it off, and I should have. Let's see if I can find it real quick. Sorry about that. Yeah, I'm not going to be able to find it on the fly, I don't think. All right, well, anyways, another interesting part that he talks about is he compares it to ethics in the Western tradition. And I'm now realizing that I'm actually going to have to make this a two-part video due to my phone's memory capacity. And in between the two parts, I'll find that quote that I was just looking for. But anyways, another part is when he compares it to Western ethics, specifically Kantianism and utilitarianism. And something that was really sort of took me off guard is Rosemont argues that role-bearing persons are actually more unique and more particular than people in the Western tradition, which sort of is contrary to what it might seem, especially looking at it from a Western perspective. We tend to think that when you sort of, when you box someone into their place as a role in relation to other people as opposed to them as an individual, you're not looking at them anymore, or at least less so, as an individual person. And you're looking at them more as a sort of generic, maybe cookie cutter, a role, basically. So I'm not, if you say that I'm not really Christopher Beaudry, I'm rather my father's son, my teacher's student, my son's father, and all this other stuff. There's a sense in the Western tradition where that doesn't really properly describe my own beliefs, fears, goals, and things like that. But Rosemont argues that this isn't really true, because whenever we really try to describe people and figure out who we are at the base level, we usually describe ourselves and identify ourselves with those roles. And all of those fears, hopes, goals, things like that, usually and basically always have to do with those roles. So instead of being us as individuals, those have more to do with our roles. And then the other thing is, role bearers are actually unique, whereas in sort of the Kantian tradition, for example, and libertarianism as well, which he says again is the conclusion of foundational individualism, people are all universally equal. There's a sort of radical equality where we're all the same. I'm going to have to end this video a little early, but I'll put it into the second part, so make sure you go look down below in the